Hello, and welcome to part two of our seminar series on Chad and its relationship with France. And this seminar is going to focus on the history of Chad, and the history of the French conquest of Chad and its governance of Chad until Chad's independence in 1960. So, to begin with, uh, it should be noted that long before the arrival of the French, violence was a recurring political feature of the territory which later became Chad. Now, three major states dominated this territory by the late 19th century. You can sort of see on this map. You can see better on this map here. Um, the Muslim sultanates of Borno, Bagirmi, and Wadai. Now, Borno is now the northeastern state, more or less northeastern state of Borno in Nigeria. Bagirmi includes parts of Chad and Cameroon, and Wadai, which is in eastern Chad. Now, each of these states had a long history of warfare, both among themselves and against other Sahelian kingdoms and smaller city-states. By the 1870s, Wadai, which has its capital in Abéché, and had its capital in Abéché, had become the most powerful of these states, and it had reduced the Sultan of Bagirmi, located just southeast of Lake Chad, to near satellite status, although it still competed for influence there with Borno. And Bagirmi's western neighbor also competed for influence in the region, especially north of Lake Chad in Kanem. Now, rivalry between these two states, so Borno and Wadai, helped to define the international politics of the region during the late 19th century. Now, one of the most significant legacies of this period, especially for understanding the post-colonial evolution of Chad, was in the fundamental importance of slavery for the region's political economy. So, the sparse population distribution in the Sahel, because of the arid climate and environment, but also because of the prevalence of the tsetse fly in the more tropical regions that made things like animal-drawn plows difficult to use for cultivation because the animals will die. This means that populations are sparse, so that large states have a hard time sustaining themselves off agricultural surpluses of subject peoples. So instead, rulers have to augment this by controlling trans-Saharan trade routes and acquiring slave labor to maintain an unproductive elite and to survive. Slaves were used in many capacities, including as farm laborers, eunuchs, concubines, household servants, and, of course, as soldiers. And they also constituted the most valuable good in local and long-distance trade. This both predates and postdates the transatlantic slave trade, although it should be noted that the transatlantic slave trade massively expanded the internal African demand for slaves, far beyond its prevalence as an institution before the 16th century. So by the 19th century, slavery was a fundamental institution for a number of African states, and this would continue until and even through the beginning of European colonialism. So to add to this, low birth rates because of gender imbalances, because most slaves that were taken were female, and high levels of mortality, ensured that rulers continued to feel the need to continually replenish their slave population, which meant that slave raiding was one of the most frequent military activities of these states in the 19th century, in addition to the wars that they waged against each other. So while these wars and netted slaves in territory, wars often risk having these states lose the same, right? Losing territory, losing slaves. So all these states, Borno, Bagirmi, Wadai, as well as a host of smaller states, targeted specifically the area south of the Cherry River for their slaving expeditions. And rulers sometimes justified this by referring to the, not always followed, prohibition in Islam against enslaving fellow Muslims. And the southern populations of Chad, on the other hand, mostly practiced local religions, or practiced at the time local religions. Today, Christianity is far more prevalent, but at the time, local religions were predominant. Furthermore, the peoples living in this region, many of whom would gradually and loosely become known together as the Sara, did not live in large states. Often the village represented the largest political unit, with power decentralized among councils of elders, religious leaders, or local chiefs. And this lack of political unity ensured that most communities in southern Chad could not resist or easily resist external aggression. So the late 19th century saw a massive increase in slave raiding in Chad. And there are several factors that contributed to this. One was the increased availability of modern firearms linked to European colonization and trade, which made it easier for these states to acquire large numbers of slaves. Access to guns and markets for slaves also expanded because of enlarged trade networks that linked the Sahel to the Mediterranean and onwards to the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere in the Middle East. And furthermore, specifically for Chad, the British seizure of Egypt in 1882 and other European advances in Africa constrained the territories that were able to be raided for slaves and also shifted the markets for the slave trade to the benefit of Chadian sultanates. Since Chad is in the center of Africa, uh, it was the farthest area, geographically speaking, from encroaching European interests. So this meant that these trade routes for the slave trade remained open, even as the Europeans were shutting down these trade routes elsewhere. So, although hard data is lacking, these slave raids in southern Chad had a huge impact on southern populations, and evidence from contemporary local accounts and later European observers suggests a loss of anywhere from between 1,000 and 10,000 people a year to raiding in the regions of southern Chad and parts of today's Central African Republic. And there's a historian named Mario Acevedo who looked at a range of contemporary sources, and he estimated that at its peak in the late 19th century, the Sera population suffered a loss of between 3 and 7% of its population every year to slave raiding. Furthermore, the transport of these chained captives from their homes to their final destinations exacted horrible tolls, particularly from disease. And estimates from other historians suggest that between 30 and 70% of these slaves died either en route to their destinations or shortly after arriving there. Slave raiding also probably increased conflict among southern communities, since some villages and leaders made deals with raiding parties, and these deals usually involved providing a fixed number of slaves in exchange for protection, which led some villages or groups of villages to launch raids themselves to avoid sending their own populations into slavery. And this made collective unity among the Sera and other southern populations very difficult to achieve in the face of increased aggression from northern sultanates. It should be noted that memory of this period remains vivid and certainly remained vivid well into the post-colonial period, especially since slave raiding didn't actually end until the 1920s, well after the French conquest had actually begun. And it's critical for understanding how Southern Chadians and their political leaders governed the country after independence. This memory of slavery and slave raids was critical to kind of fashioning their fears and their political ambitions in the post-colonial era. So, to continue, regional politics was disrupted considerably in the 1890s by the arrival of a slave raider slash warlord slash state builder, depending on how you want to call him, Rabah al-Zubayr. He was from Sudan, and his conquests provided a convenient opening and local allies for French territorial ambitions. In particular, he managed to defeat Bagirmi and Borno, the Bagirmi and Borno sultanates, and he imposed policies of crushing taxation. He threatened his neighbors, and he exacted a murderous toll on local traders in order to extract resources from them. And this led to regional balancing of states against him, particularly the Sokoto Caliphate in present-day Nigeria and the Sultanate of Zinder in Niger. And this was a perfect opening for French military officials who were bent on beating their German and British rivals to the Lake Chad Basin, who now benefited from local allies who were more afraid of Urabe and his expansion and his governance style and his slave raiding than they were of European expansion. So, benefiting from these local alliances, the three French columns converged on Rabe's base near present-day Jamina and defeated him in a bloody battle in Kuseri, which is right across the river in Cameroon. Now, Urabe was killed and decapitated by the French, who paraded his head around and displayed it to anybody who wanted to see it, also to prove to other local communities that Rabe was in fact dead and the French had killed him. At the same time, the commander of one of the French columns, Commandant Amadi François Lamy, was also killed in this battle, and that led to the future French settlement on the site being named Fort Lamy, which was the capital of Chad until it was renamed Jamina in 1973. Now, following the Battle of Kuseri, and it should be noted that the French advance and the French conquests were in many ways no less bloody than Rabe's rule, or the rule of the different sultanates, because the French enlisted huge numbers of forced labor to transport supplies and to support their movements of their columns, which resulted in horrendous death tolls. And one of the columns that invaded Chad, the Voulay Chanoine mission, was so notorious in its brutality that it actually caused a scandal back in France when its two commanders actually tried to break away from French control themselves and establish their own polity in Central Africa, and they were chased down by French military officers and eventually killed by their own men. But a policy of brutality and forced labor was not simply a monopoly of Muslim sultanates in the 19th century. This was a common practice of all state builders in Central Africa during the time, in part because this sparse nature of population distributions meant that to sustain any kind of centralized administration, you need to force people to submit and force people to provide surpluses in order to support an unproductive elite. And this is something that would continue to plague the colonial administration, the French colonial administration, but also the British and the Germans. And plague might not be the word, but because they couldn't enforce taxation or other kinds of payment, they would resort often to forced labor. And forced labor in conditions that would be as bad as or even worse than the slavery that they nominally had intended to or used as a pretext of ending. Now, following the Battle of Kuseri and the subsequent mopping up operations, which aimed to consolidate French gains, that was in the year 1900, by the way, the French formally established the Territoire Militaire des Pays Protectorats du Tchad. This is the beginning of the Chadian colony. They placed areas formerly under Rabat's control, so generally north of the 7th parallel, under military control, and territory south of that under civil administration. And they offered the Sultanate of Baguirmi, which had been defeated by Rabat but had been an ally, nominal autonomy in return for its agreement to end its slave raiding operations in southern Chad, and also in return for them to pay for the French occupation costs. That effectively ended their independence. Meanwhile, the French took inspiration from Rabat's administrative system. As I said, the French felt constrained the same way that different African state builders felt constrained. So while they expressed horror at Rabat's cruelty, French officials admitted to a, quote, certain admiration. This is an expression used by the head of one of the French columns, Emile Gentil. He expressed a certain admiration for Rabat's success in governing his extensive territories, inhabited by diverse peoples, by dividing political authority among local and more centralized potentates. They felt this allowed Rabat to gather taxes without facing the perennial problem of revolts by people in the periphery or the nobility, and the French adapted the same system, that is, ruling through local chiefs or leaders who were basically loyal to the French but could exercise local authority and local control. The British were notorious for this kind of system, which they later systematized and called it indirect rule, but the French did the same thing. One of the biggest problems the French faced, though, was that in southern Chad, they had serious problems developing an effective tax base because the dispersed and stateless communities living there in the Sahara made it very difficult to establish a centralized administration. The poverty of the territory made it very difficult for French officers to find the means to pay for state administration, and constraints coming from Paris meant that France would only, the metropole, would only directly fund military operations and force the colonies instead to live off of its own resources, so they had to pay for itself through its own taxation, rather than being subsidized by France. This meant the vast majority of revenues came from head taxes and taxes on livestock, and the idea here eventually for the French was to replace taxes paid in kind or in local silver currencies with taxes paid in francs. And this, of course, involved trying to get people to earn francs, and forced labor was a way of doing that, but also trying to create economic activities, and trade was another way of doing that. The implementation of this policy ultimately had devastating effects. So, in an effort to deflect criticism of expensive military operational occupation costs, which were clear given the distance of Chad from France or from other French bases, and in keeping with Paris's insistence on self-sufficiency, colonial officials did everything they could to maintain budgetary surpluses. Now, The only way to do this in a situation of dire poverty and a complete lack of infrastructure is through systematic extortion, creative accounting, refusal to invest in any kind of economic development, and uh, cutting any kind of public expenditures to the minimum, which meant that the early colonial regime taxed a lot and spent very little. And this ensured that Chad would become what a lot of historians have later called the richest of the poorest colonies, largely off the backs of its people. So the administration built quite a war chest for itself, but the population itself suffered enormously, particularly in southern Chad. Now, France, officials in France made this a lot worse by refusing or failing to ship enough francs, French currency, to Chad, which led to recurring currency shortages, which contributed to commercial crises, and the lack of currency with which to pay taxes and to purchase goods inflicted severe hardship on the territory. And this became particularly bad during the First World War, when the French administration refused to accept payment in kind or in local currencies. And this exacerbated a major drought and famine, which was occurring at the same time, which made the problem worse. Now, this also led to increased price of food, and this was combined with doubling of taxes on livestock, which led to several major uprisings during the First World War, which the French brutally suppressed, with several tens of thousands, or perhaps even more deaths. It's hard to say. Now, ultimately, after the First World War, France did transfer most of the country to a civilian administration, partly in response to criticisms of military rule. But this didn't lead to major changes in the fiscal practices of the new Chadian administration. Um, and meanwhile, this policy of maintaining budget surpluses and not spending money for economic development continued. Um, I should add that at the same time all this is happening, the first 2 decades of French rule were not particularly peaceful. The defeat of Rabat and the subjugation of Baguirmi to client status still meant that France faced two major regional powers determined to contain their expansion. So one was Wadai, in the Sultanate of Wadai in eastern Chad, which was quite powerful, and the Senussia, which was a powerful Muslim Sufi order or brotherhood based out of Libya, which at the time was nominally controlled by Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and then Italy. So after Rabat died, Wadai Sultan refused French demands to end the slave trade because it was central to the Sultanate's economy, so he couldn't. Furthermore, they rebuffed French requests to open their borders to French missionaries and exploration. And this, combined with the close links to this Muslim political order from Brotherhood from Libya, the Senussia, made a major clash almost inevitable. Now, as they would in later decades, the French had a tendency to have a very simplified form of political analysis that linked any kind of subversion or efforts to contest French rule or French domination to kind of manipulation or puppeteering from behind the scenes. And at this point in time, they blamed the Senussia, this Muslim Sufi order, as an entity with tremendous influence and mobilizing power, and their main real enemy in Northern Africa. French writers described its adherents as fanatics, and for much of the early 20th century, they were alleging their hidden hand behind pretty much any number of French conspiracies or uprisings. Now, Wadai did have close links to the Senussi Brotherhood, but these didn't conform to French fantasies, and the Senussi certainly did not control Wadai. But in any case, both powers strongly resisted French expansion. Now, the Senussi had a strong presence in southern Libya and northern Chad, with a network of fortified schools and lodges that would across different trade routes, and combined with proselytization and alliance building with different political elites, it gave this order kind of state-like authority over most of the trade routes linking Benghazi with Kufra in Libya, and then point south, especially Abashe and Wadai. So Wadai was particularly dependent on the Senussia for their economic links to the Mediterranean. Now, this trade route flourished at the end of the 19th century, but because of basically by the time the First World War rolled around, or even before, basically with the Libyan conquest the Italian conquest of Libya, Uh, this shut down kind of the economic possibilities for Wadai to maintain itself as a viable state. And this also hurt the Sanusia as well. So, despite this, the Sanusia and the Wadai continued to resist French advances. The Sanusia fought the French in Kanem, which is north of Lake Chad, and also in the vast desert territories of Porco Inadi and Tibesti, the BT. And these territories, which were and remain sparsely inhabited by highly mobile and pastoral communities, mostly Tubu, these offered a formidable challenge to the extension of French military authority and would continue to pose a huge challenge to the future post-colonial Chadian state in terms of establishing its authority there. It took the French over a decade to establish at least nominal control over the northern half of Chad. Um, Now, Wadai was more centralized and geographically concentrated, um, but it was also very difficult to overthrow. The Sultan and his partisans managed to slaughter several French columns in 1909, 1910, and only the following year did French troops, in 1911, did French troops finally manage to defeat him, and they formally occupied the Sultanate and dissolved it in 1912. So the defeat of Wadai and its transformation from a powerful sultanate into a colonial periphery would have lasting consequences in the Chadian state, and it would become a core element of rebellion against the Chadian state in the post-colonial era. So meanwhile, the combination of internal squabbles in Wadai, warfare against the French, and colonial conquest had a catastrophic impact within Wadai itself. So between 1913 and 1918, a very harsh French occupation regime and repression exacerbated the impact of a series of major droughts that were occurring at the same time, leading to a major famine in Wadai, and I hinted that this was happening all over Chad. According to French estimates, something like 300,000 people died in Wadai during this 5-year period, constituting about half the region's population. And partly this was a result of French rule and the French management of the famine. Now, over the next few years, the French extended their control over a large portion of Chad. Beginning in the 1920s, though, French administrators were looking for ways to make the country more profitable. So they turned to cotton as a potentially lucrative export industry. Now, you can't grow cotton in the Sahel very well, and you certainly can't grow cotton in the desert, but in southern Chad you could. So the French colonial authorities decided to impose it in 1928 as a requirement, as a legal requirement for farmers. So cotton cultivation became generalized throughout the 5 prefectures that constitute southern Chad. And throughout the colonial period, small landholders dominated production. By 1954, something like 451,000 planters worked on 215,000 hectares. Colonial authorities made cultivation obligatory by setting per capita production quotas, which in some years people could meet, in other years, because of climatic conditions or maybe family tragedies, they couldn't. In addition to its contribution to the colonial economy, cotton cultivation on a mass scale allowed the colonial government to extract taxes in a newly monetized economy, which then also allowed the colonial administration to pay for itself. And they also only granted one company, a private company called Coton Front, exclusive rights to the purchase, ginning, transportation, and marketing of the cotton. And this company would often offer only below market rates to producers and provide them with little or no resources or incentives to invest in new methods or equipment that could increase cotton output. So it's a very kind of short-termist approach to economic development. And these arrangements in this situation continued into well after independence. However, although Cotton Fran acted as a marketing board and generated revenues for the state, the peasants themselves, they suffered from a regime that continuously demanded increased cotton output at the expense of subsistence crops, and this would contribute to a number of famines and periods of severe hardship for southern communities, not just during colonial rule, but afterwards when the newly independent Chadian government, desperate for resources, would do the same thing by trying to squeeze as much as it could out of the cotton cultivating South. Now, in a lot of ways, the Sara and other Southerners would suffer the most from colonialism in the territory, because in addition to imposed cotton cultivation, they served as a major source of forced labor, most notoriously for railroad construction in the colony of Congo-Brazzaville, in which 20,000 Sara were drafted, 10,000 died through disease or through overwork. Southern populations were also targeted exclusively for army conscription and infrastructure projects. But at the same time, and this is really important to understand for getting a sense of what happened afterwards, what happened during Chad's independence period. Most of the small number of Chadians who were educated in the colonial system were also Sara. The limited number of roads and schools and other infrastructural investments also went to the south to support the cotton economy. So in many ways, although the Sara suffered the most from colonialism, uh, at a macroeconomic level and later at a political level, the South as a region benefited more than anywhere else in Chad. So this meant that Southerners would eventually dominate the government, the state bureaucracy, and regional administrations of the entirety of independent Chad. And these Sara elites and administrators, mostly Sara, who were largely Christian or practiced local religions, had very little in common with the rest of the country. Um, so in 1960, population estimates for Chad ranged at around 3 million people. Now, about half of those, ethnically heterogeneous and divided between nomadic, pastoralist, and sedentary communities, lived in and live in the northern two-thirds of the country, and were almost entirely Muslim. Now, for the most part, these communities did not fully collaborate with the French colonial attempts at assimilation, so communities would not send their children to French schools, and also the French, as I said, didn't invest so much in developing the North, so they didn't invest much in building schools or other kinds of infrastructure, um, which combined with few infrastructure projects and military operations aimed at suppressing political independence, uh, meant that the northern half of Chad, or northern two-thirds of Chad, geographically speaking, were essentially cut off, treated with a form of alternatingly benign and malign neglect by the French colonial authorities, which also meant that these populations and their elites were not integrated into the colonial apparatus when the French began to try to bring in Chadians to govern the territory with them. Hence, from the northern point of view, an independent Chad in 1960 only really represented the replacement of one set of colonial overlords with another, so a replacement of the French with southern Chadians. And this combined with racism and ambient disdain towards the southern quote unquote slaves, which was often a part of northern discourse, exacerbated this feeling of humiliation, this feeling of marginalization. Now, after the Second World War, the French began to devolve more power, more autonomy, and more power to Africans in France's African colonies, particularly by the 1950s. And they did a lot to promote African elites who were loyal to France, who could promote French interests, but who could also provide at least a veneer of African participation in their own colonial situation. Now, by the night after the Second World War, France also legalized the creation of African political parties or political movements. And in Chad, the main vehicle for Southern political elites became a political party called the Parti Progressiste Chadien, or the Chadian Progressive Party. Now, it was initially created in 1946 as a party meant to represent all kind of progressive Chadians throughout the territory, as a nationalist party. And its early mobilizing slogan was "No more cotton, no more chiefs, and no more taxes," which especially appealed to Southerners who suffered from all three, but also appealed to, in theory, should have appealed to people all throughout the territory. But quickly it became clear that it was a party that only or exclusively represented Southern interests. And initially, this radicalism meant that French officials didn't support it and did everything they could to repress it and prevent its victory in local elections. But as the more marginalized northern Muslim parties began to radicalize in a more anti-French direction in the 1950s, French official support began to move back towards the PPT, the Parti Progressiste Chadien. And this ended up being the party that had the most amount of political power and controlled the territory's government when Chad was granted independence in 1960. Now, it's important to know that Chad's independence, unlike for a lot of other African countries, or unlike for a lot of other countries in general, um, was not directly the fruit of political struggle by Chadian political elites and leaders. Instead, wider forces linked to the unsustainability of the French Empire in general meant that all of France's remaining West and Central African colonies, as well as Madagascar, gained their independence in 1960. And this resulted in part from the cost and political polarization generated by the Algerian War, combined with the rising power of African political elites, especially in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali, and to some extent Guinea. But Chad was really at the margins of this. It also responded to global trends and shifting norms, partly as a result of the Cold War and the Second World War, which called the legitimacy of colonialism itself into question. And more immediately, it stemmed from an inability of French and African elites to agree on the organization and modalities of a French community, which would link semi-autonomous African territories to France in a kind of renewed French Empire, which, for obvious reasons, a lot of African elites didn't want to remain part of. So, what followed, though, despite the formal name of independence given to most of these African states, and as I mentioned before, was more of an imperial restructuring than an end of empire. The transition was also very much a joint project between French and African elites, and African leaders throughout the former empire benefited politically and economically by maintaining close ties to France. And French power and resources allowed them, these leaders, to consolidate their authority. And in exchange, these African elites would serve as conduits for French influence and power. And in Chad, that conduit would be the leader of the Parti Progressiste Tchadien, François Tombalbaye. And that is the man you see in the picture right there. And he would become Chad's first president, and would lead Chad for the first decade and a half of its period of formal independence from France. And I'm going to end the presentation here because the next one is going to be about the first wave of French interventionism in the country, which begins with a discussion of François Tombalbaye and the policies that he implemented. Because as many African elites in many other countries discovered, Tombalbaye figured out that once he was in power, he faced the same kind of constraints that the colonial leaders faced in terms of trying to mobilize enough resources to both support his own personal ambitions and to consolidate state authority over a vast and sparsely populated territory. And the kinds of strategies he would use to do these things would eventually lead to rebellion and war, and he would eventually become increasingly dependent on France to maintain his own authority in his country. So I'm going to end it here. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and I look forward to talking to all of you in our live meeting later this week. Goodbye.